today, Professor Donna Robinson Devine from Smith College, the Morning Star Family Professor of Jewish Studies and Professor of Government Emerita. She is the former president of the Association for Israel Studies and has been affiliated with Haifa University. And in focusing on what word choice do we use to try to effectively respond to the kind of false and inflammatory rhetoric that is too often heard. And by responding, I'm talking about not to people who are just yelling slogans and don't care what anybody says, but if you're actually going to have a conversation with somebody. I was struck by Donna's 2019 article, Word Crimes Reclaiming the Language of the Israeli-Palestinian Conflict. And I'm just going to pick out 2 sentences from there, or 3 sentences from there for the introduction, then I'm going to turn it over to Professor Devine. So talking about Israel 5 years ago in this article, once a trope for self-sacrifice and solidarity, a testament to the redemption of a bruised and battered people, the Jewish state today stands accused of practicing apartheid, genocide, ethnic cleansing, and of sustaining itself as a remnant of an outdated and thoroughly delegitimized colonial order. The Jewish state has not simply been rebranded, it has been essentially been renamed. Once thought distinctive, Israel's singularity is now presented as an example of horrific bigotry, if not savagery. So, Professor Devine, how does language become so incredibly politicized in this way? And what words should we think of choosing in order to respond to this kind of inflammatory, inaccurate, and unfair rhetoric?
Thank you for the generous introduction. And I'm going to try to answer your questions partly with this by going through some of the words that you see. Can you see the screen share?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. Okay, so how did this come about? Before I get into what I talk about or follow the particular issues that you want, I want to frame this with 2 general trends. Colleges in the United States and probably in the Western world face a demographic challenge. In the next 10 or 20 years, the age cohort in America that normally goes to college will decline, some say by 30%. And colleges have known, college administrators and presidents have known this for a while. And so the question is, how do you compensate for this? How do you keep your departments alive, your faculty operational? How do you keep the university that was at its peak, let's say 20 or 30 years ago, how do you keep that university growing, bringing in funds, filling all the beds that they need to in every beginning semester? And so there have been a bunch of strategies for this. One is to look outside of America for students. And particularly in China or Japan, where students actually have, their parents have enough money to pay the tuition. Some universities have looked strongly at the Middle East, where you have American particularly American and international organizations funding educational institutions like UNRWA or in the Palestinian territories. And so a few years ago, the highest number of Fulbright students came from the Palestinian territories or Gaza. So there were all of these ways in which you could find enough students to fill your beds, let's say. And then, of course, the university sought funding from as many places as were willing to fund Islamic institutes from Qatar, Saudi Arabia. And so the budget was met, budget expectations were met by this. But there was also enormous pressure on faculty, particularly in the humanities, where students didn't seem to be flowing naturally to courses. There was an enormous pressure on the humanities to show that they were relevant, to fill their classes. And so a number of years ago, many in the humanities seized on ideas that were raised by scholars that really literature was a kind of vehicle for politics that embedded in all sorts of texts. Let's take, 19th century or just English literature, embedded in Jane Austen or Darwin, were all sorts of political messages about not only English society or British society, but the rest of the world. And so you had the notion of what's called Orientalism, that everything that was said and done by countries that conquered other places in the world for their raw material or for strategic reasons, that there was this notion that they also developed a discourse that tried to reinforce their own superiority. So England didn't conquer India simply because it wanted to expand its own riches. It conquered India because it was inherently superior to the Indian religions, the Indian populations. From this also developed the notion of something called settler colonialism, which I'll talk about. So the notion was that any entity that had anything to do with colonialism was tainted. It was a sin, you were born with this sin, and this sin was affixed to you. And no matter what you did in the world, what your politics was, you really couldn't escape it. When October 7th occurred, now we know more or less what happened on October 7th. That is, we know about the rapes and the murders and the tortures and beheadings. I mean, the horrific savagery of what was done to the people who live on the Gaza border, but not only, or who worked there. And that was not only Jews, but you also had Arabs and you had workers from Thailand. What happened has been documented, and who documented it? The people who perpetuated these crimes, these criminal acts, these horrific atrocities. The people who committed these atrocities were very proud of them. They had videos, they phoned their parents to say, to tell them what they did. So it wasn't as if you could hide it. It wasn't as if you could deny it if you were rational if you believed in empirical evidence. But almost instantly on the college campuses, this became a cause for exhilaration, as one professor at Cornell called it, or the beginning of liberation, as another at Columbia. You had demonstrations at what we consider the universities that teach the best and the brightest, universities that graduate people who go into very high level, sophisticated careers, both in government and in the media. You had those people applauding these atrocities, this kind of barbarism. And it didn't take very long. It occurred before the Israelis began any response. And part of the reason that it occurred so spontaneously, and part of the reason it erupted in this way, was that there were faculty who embraced this notion that any entity that was tainted by colonialism could not really be an entity that could do any good. So what you have is a theory, let's say, a theory that applies to an America where Columbus discovering America has to be renamed to Indigenous Day, because you have to acknowledge the crimes and the destruction of the society that was in the Americas before it became America. Or the same could be said with regard to Australia or New Zealand. And college students and really kindergarten students in the United States, certainly for decades, have been made aware that the land on which their schools are built or their towns are built is not really theirs. It was taken by force. And the theory that if it was once taken by force hundreds of years ago, the theory says that that violence is embedded in that culture forever. So, for example, in the United States, because of Columbus and because of indigeneity and all of that, the theory is that even if you now try to compensate Native Americans, that the extent to which Native Americans might accept such an compensation puts them in league with an evil system that taints them. So there can be no improvement. But the faculty know that it would be impossible to dismantle, let's say, the United States or Australia or New Zealand. They're too big. But there is one country small enough to think of dismantling. And that's part of what drove the campus riots. The other part is that they were from COVID and for the last several years with movements like Black Lives Matter and defunding the police and other sort of progressive movements that have been operating in the past few years, the pro-Palestine, the Students for Palestine, the people who've embraced the Palestinian cause have interacted, have allied with them to say that the world is really divided into the oppressor and oppressed. And the class of the oppressed runs strictly through Palestine. So when the atrocities occurred after October 7th, this was a chance, this was an opening for all of these different progressive groups to align once again and raise issues of what they consider social justice. So the classic term that wraps the notion of oppression is the Nakba, the 1948. Now, the term Nakba in Arabic means catastrophe. It could mean a hurricane, a flood. It could mean, any kind of natural disaster. And it was first used in political discourse in the Middle East by a Syrian professor in Lebanon, who really used it in the 1950s, not to point to draw attention to the Palestinians or even the Palestinian refugees. He was drawing attention to the lack of military expertise among the Arab states who were defeated by the Jews and by Israel. And he said, his argument was that this was a catastrophe because it showed that the Arab states weren't unified enough. They had not developed educationally enough or technically enough, and that's why they lost. This term has changed and become a term to describe Palestinian identity, to tell the world that the Palestinians are so dispossessed, so displaced, that they face an enemy so ruthless and savage that all they can do, they have no choice to negotiate any kind of reasonable political aim for themselves or reasonable political program for themselves. All they can do is react with violence. Now, this is a myth, and I'll explain in just a minute. But the point is that the Palestinians have promoted a definition of their own collective identity as people so weak, so oppressed, that the world that wants justice, the people who want justice, have to become tribunes for them, have to become their spokespeople if justice will be done. Now, this sort of reinforces the notion that the Palestinians, above all, are innocent victims. And that with this attack, if you're dedicated enough to a cause that's sacred, this was called by the Hamas group as a razzia, to a raid that resonates with Islamic history and what Muhammad did in the Arabian Peninsula. So if you are dedicated enough to a cause, they really believe that you can undo 1948. The attack was partly about showing people that history can be redone, reset. And they did it I would say this is a kind of mythical view of the world. They did it partly out of a kind of strategic brilliance, because they knew that in many sectors of the academy, and now having, the people who graduated with this education are now in all sorts of influential positions, that this would resonate and be supported by those people who understand that the world is filled with the remnants of settler colonialism. And, and so they knew from past conflicts that if they have enough Palestinian casualties, if people will see on their TV night after night pictures of dead Palestinians and bombed out areas of Gaza, that they will be able to get international intervention to stop the fighting, settle more or less on those terms. They could bury their weapons until they have to exhume them for the next battle. I mean, that was the strategic plan. They also had reason to believe that because the Gaza had been enveloped and entwined with the UN organization that deals with Palestinian refugees. I mean, the notion, this is the only refugee group that is allowed to give its children and grandchildren the legacy of refugee status. So out of 700,000 displaced Palestinians in 1948, you now have, 8 million Palestinians dealt with under the rubric of UNRWA. So the Palestinians made these calculations, or Hamas made these calculations, knowing that, or expecting that they would get aid from international organizations. But the scope of the atrocities and the scope of dead Israelis really changed the configuration. There was no choice that Israel had to respond. The prime minister said almost immediately that Israel was at war. It wasn't simply a conflict. It wasn't simply a simple, or it wasn't simply some acts that they had to respond to. It wasn't simply resistance. It was a war. And Israel is a country of roughly 10 million people, or almost 10 million people, surrounded by 500 million people who are more or less hostile to it. So the question that, any reasonable democratic state would have to answer is how to respond in a way that not only protects the citizens of a country, but also convinces the hostile powers not to initiate or trigger another war. And that's what we political scientists call deterrence. So you have to do a lot of there has to be a lot of destruction to convince a group like Hamas, or a group that in some way supports Hamas, not to try this again. And so what we were seeing in Gaza, and then followed by what we're seeing in Lebanon, is a persistent system of bombing, finding, killing leaders, military leaders, technical leaders of either in Gaza, Hamas, in the north of Hezbollah, and then trying to create areas that would serve as protection for Israeli citizens. Because make no mistake, this I have the word mechdal here. Mechdal is a Hebrew term that the root of which means to suck the life out of. I mean, it's a screw up. And make no mistake, this word was used for the 73 war when the Israelis were more or less taken by surprise by the attack of Egypt and Syria. But this was a much more serious failure on the part of the Israeli state. For the first time since 1948, areas that had been conquered in 1948 were occupied for a while by Hamas or jihad fighters. You have 60 to 70,000 people who had been evacuated from the north. You have lands that are the heartland in the Galilee, the heartland of Zionist culture, that have been attacked and are continually attacked. So this was an enormous failure on the part of the state to protect its citizens, and eventually they'll have to deal with that in some governmental inquiry that has to take place to find out what exactly happened. There have been two small inquiries with regard to what happened at Kibbutz Be'eri and one other kibbutz, and they raise more questions than they answer. Here is where the narrative is very different from the facts, because the narrative of settler colonialism and Nakba and Palestinian weakness is no less wrong about Palestinian history. It keeps Palestinians from their own history. Palestinian leaders from as early as the 1930s decided to make Palestine a cause rather than try to achieve a state, try to achieve some sort of land that they could build a state. And they did it partly because they wanted to serve their own interests, but there's lots of documentation about this. When Arafat, what they did in the 1930s was to cede control, to outsource control to the heads of Arab states. What they did when Arafat took over was to try to reclaim sort of ownership of the Palestinian cause, but Arafat himself was not totally convinced that a state which required compromising was better than just fighting trying to fight for the cause of Palestine, even if that meant lots of people would be killed. The Palestinians were building a state in the late 1990s, and then when he at Camp David, when Arafat was asked to commit to some sort of resolution of the conflict, he decided to push for a second intifada. And that really rolled back the achievements towards statehood that the Palestinians had made in the 1990s, and the default position of the Palestinians was all or nothing. And so thus far, they have nothing. And if you look at what they were offered from in the 1937 Peel proposal, they were offered some 80% of Mandate Palestine. Now we're talking about under 20% of Mandate Palestine. So the trajectory is not really in their favor. The notion that Israel is an apartheid state is really ridiculous. You have Ethiopian Jews, you have Afro Israel music from people who work in Israel, who've immigrated to Israel, who've served in the Israeli army. You have more and more Arab Israelis serving in the army. And the thing is, after October 7th, when the reserves were called to come back, you had 130,000 people showing up and responding to the call. This is not a country that doesn't care about its state, and this is a country that will fight for its state. So let me stop there so we can have time for questions. And I'm happy to, if I didn't touch anything that you want to ask, I'm happy to.
Okay. So first, would you end the screen share?
Yeah.
And Pierce, will you make sure that we can now see the people who are here with us, which I'm only able to see a few of, but I can go across. But okay, that's good. That's perfect. So, but Donna, let me ask you to give an example here, and then I'll look for people to raise your electronic or your physical hand in just a second. So if you are in a room with people who are genuinely going to be interested in the answer to the question, all right, what will you say when somebody says, explain why Israel is not settler colonialism, to give an example to our group?
Okay, I'll give you two examples. Number one, in terms of the text for indigeneity, we have far more written texts for Jewish indigeneity than for certainly Muslim indigeneity. We know when the Muslims conquered what became Palestine, and that was certainly in the 7th century. We'll, talk about that. And the Zionist movement actually romanticized the Arabs. Zionism, classical Zionism, was a movement to liberate the Jews not only from foreign oppression and bring them to the land of Israel and create a new collective society, but they wanted to free people from the rabbis. This was not they wanted to, what we today might use the term secularize Judaism. So they wanted the Zionist position, for the most part, officially, as was the Israeli position officially, to share the land. That has how to share the land or when to share the land is another question. But they want, and they need, it's obvious given the demography, they need a group of Palestinians who want to live in peace with them. And that's what the Oslo Accords was supposed to achieve.
Okay. All right. So let me now see if anybody has a question, if you would wave at me or raise your electronic hand. Most of your screens are off, so I'll have no idea if your screen is off, by the way, what you're doing, because I can't see it. And I'm okay. So I'm not seeing anything at the moment. Okay, Barbara. Okay, so let's see here.
Thank you so very much. This was very interesting, especially the information about the universities and what they've been teaching and why our students, have taken the positions that they've been taking. When I'm reading the newer history of Israel, I grew up thinking that the Zionists came and purchased all the land. And now the newer approach is they may have purchased it from landowners, but the landowners weren't there. And the people working the land didn't feel like they had been, it felt like they were just losing the land that they were working on. And that there was a whole other sense that later during the war, that the Arabs should leave because the other countries were going to win anyway. And so there was no sense that they voluntarily left, but that they had to leave. And so there's this unfinished business about wanting to come back, which all of this is confusing to me, and maybe you can clarify. I also thought that if you won a war, you won the land. That's true in other countries and other wars, but not in this one. So anything that you can do to clarify that would be helpful. Thank you.
Oh, you're very welcome. Okay, so Zionism started before World War One, and in the late 19th century, and even before, a little before Theodor Herzl appears on the scene. But they did send to the Ottoman-controlled, what was the Ottoman-controlled Palestine, they had money and they sent land purchases. So some of the land was actually purchased. And some of the money raised for those purchases even came from America, from contributions. Relatively little land was purchased before World War One. Once World War One occurs and the British control Palestine, they begin to try to, let's say, regularize land purchases. They take over from the Ottomans had some sense of what was private land, what was state land, owned by the Ottoman government. And the British try to regularize this, and they really try to bend over backwards, we might say, to give Arabs some, I mean, they understand from the beginning that this is a controversial thing they're doing, and they try to give give some Arabs bequests of land. But the Jews do purchase land from what might be called absentee landowners. Because remember, before World War One, there was no difference, let's say, between in terms of your rulership. If you lived in Lebanon, or you lived south of Haifa, or you lived in Beirut, you were still part of the Ottoman Empire. And so lots of the land in Palestine was purchased by Beirut bankers. And so some of that land was purchased later by Zionists. Having said that, all of the land purchases before 48 were probably no more than 20% of what was British mandated Palestine, maybe a little more. The war in 48 allowed, we might say, allowed by force, allowed the Zionists and Israel to get more land, to get much more land, because they conquered it. Two things about the Palestinian displacement or the Palestinian refugees. As soon as the partition resolution was passed in November 29th, 1947, you had Palestinian elites leaving, thinking there's going to be trouble, let's get out of the way. These were elites that may have had contacts in Cairo, Edward Said and his family did, or contacts in Beirut. They may have had relatives in other parts of the Arab world, and they left. So you had an elite, what was the elite, the leaders leaving almost immediately and voluntarily. And then you had some areas where leaders assuming, Arab leaders assuming that they were going to win the war, where they told, let's say, loads of Arabs in the Haifa area to leave, and other places. Once the war began, after 1948, when you had the Israelis fighting against 7 Arab armies, when the Israelis conquered the 2 Arab cities of Ramla and Lud, Ben-Gurion, Yitzhak Rabin was the military leader there. Ben-Gurion seems to have told him, send them on their way. Because he said, okay, we'll conquer them. What do we do with them after we conquer them? And he said, he seemed to tell them to march to Jordan. So probably about half the 700,000 were expelled. Now the United Nations Assembly voted on a resolution 180 that the many Palestinians says gives them the right of return. Actually, resolution 180 says that people should be allowed to return to their homes if they are willing to live at peace with Israel. Now, resolution 180, which was passed probably in 1949 or after the war, was every Arab state voted against it. So it wasn't read as giving the Palestinians a right of return when it was passed. It's now been reinterpreted. So there have been, negotiations between some early Israeli governments. The Israelis did do minimal some minimal reunification of Palestinian families in the early 50s. But in war, war has consequences. When you go to war, you have consequences. So that was it. And it's not as if I want to stress, it's not as if that the Israelis were purely moral. You can't fight a war and be purely moral. You can't even do politics and be purely moral because you use force. The thing is that the Palestinians did not have in 1948 the kind of unified society that Israel had. Not that Israel was perfectly unified, but it was more unified. And it had more of a structure of norms and expectations. Again, it wasn't perfect. There are lots of ways you can criticize what happened, and a lot of what happened, remember, Israel in 1948 did not have the kind of army it has in 2024 with battalions and strict training and all of this. A lot of what happened, even from the Israeli side in that war, happened because of local commanders who may or may not have listened to the people above them. It was very difficult to impose absolute order.
So let me pick up before I go on with your last answer in one respect, Donna, which fits in with the theme, which is this. For many of us, many of the people feel uncomfortable in defending the existence of Israel with admitting the flaws of Israel. From the standpoint of political discussion, assuming it's a genuine political discussion here.
It's a big assumption.
As opposed to the people who are just sitting there to gameplay and throw slogans back at each other. We can all lob political hand grenades. But from the assuming that it's a genuine discussion, and from persuasion, it sounds to me like you would say you would be the kind of person who would take the position Israel should exist in lots of points, but not be afraid to acknowledge some of the flaws that you feel about the country as well. Is my understanding correct about how you would approach these situations?
Well, let me, I once gave a talk, and I think it was on my my sheet called #Israel, Blessing or Curse. How do you decide? How do you decide that a state should exist? I mean, let's forget about Israel for a second. No less a theorist than Jean-Jacques Rousseau in The Social Contract, in book 3, I believe, says, what are the marks of a successful state? How do you know a state is successful? How do you know it's legitimate? You know how you know? He says, at the beginning, you look at population growth. Now, Israel in 1948 was under 1 million. Under 1 million. And what is it today? Close to 10. What is its standard of living? I mean, this is not a failed state. This is not a state that usually doesn't work. Having said that, I think it would be remiss, and we have evidence that the election of 2022, which returned Benjamin Netanyahu to the office of prime minister with a coalition of people of parties, some of which are not fully Zionist, but some very problematic policies, that coalition, which wrapped itself around radical judicial reform that tore the country apart for 9 months, was a factor in Yahya Sinwar's decision to launch the attacks on October 7th. I mean, he says the whole idea of I haven't mentioned Iran, and I should mention Iran. The whole idea of Iran, giving funds and weapons to Hezbollah, to Hamas, to militias in Iraq, to the Houthis. I mean, how many people really know the Houthis? The whole idea, this was what Iran calls a ring of fire, so that if anybody came for the mullahs, if anybody attacked Iran, they could get these other groups to protect them. But they were supposed to wait until there was a threat against Iran. When Yahya Sinwar launched his attack, he also launched a kind of hostile takeover of that whole theory. And so what you have at this point is the kind of upheaval that requires not only a military response. It's been brilliant, the military north and in Gaza, but it also requires serious political backup, and that thus far has failed. In other words, what we know at this point is that there's no post accommodation, or there are no plans for what happens. How will Gaza be administered after Israel decides it's fought enough? There's nothing more to wage war against. And that, and what I'm saying is, it has just been said by the Minister of Defense Gallant, who was fired the other day. So there are deep questions about the political policies that Israel seems not to have shaped at this point.
All right, other questions and comments? Chuck, I think I have to unmute you, so.
There we go.
Okay.
Well, thank you for all this interesting information. I'm wondering if we could go back to the academic university world with the recent election, which shows the electorate moving to the right. I'm wondering if you see any reflection of that at the universities, on the university level, faculty. Is there anything happening there that
I would be shocked if there was something happening except mourning. I mean, MOURNING. The university is a problem because you have tenured people, and you have and the places I know best. I mean, apart from Smith, I know Columbia. I describe, when people ask me where I got my doctorate, I say I got it at Columbia when you were required to know something beyond slogans. At any rate, what you have at the universities is a system of governance that places a great deal of power and influence in the hands of a faculty, and that means the faculty who are tenured, because they give life or death to other people. They're controlling hierarchy. And a college president has two jobs: one, to raise money, and two, to keep the campus quiet. I don't think the Board of Trustee exactly cares how they keep the campus quiet. So when you have, I mean, I went as an undergraduate, I went to Brandeis, which will surprise no one. But at any rate, the president was just replaced because the faculty voted no confidence. Whatever, you know, whatever the reasons, he didn't raise enough money, he's closing departments. I mean, those are the kind of things that faculty will object to. You saw presidents, the president at Columbia brought in the police, or there were some arrests because of campus, because some protesters took over buildings and, you know, violated laws. And the faculty, and even though there were there were punishments or sanctions imposed on those students, in most cases, the faculty erased them. So you have a lot of faculty power, and you're not going to change. I'm not sure how you can change it. You can change a newspaper, let's say, much more easily, because you can fire people. But you can't. The faculty is much more complicated.
Orange too.
And I don't know that, and people, I mean, faculty people don't change their minds. You know, they don't say, oh, well, I was wrong about that, let me rethink, you know, and there's been, you have faculty, not all, you know, but you have faculty who are so convinced that not only what they're doing is academically sound, but it's moral. And it's, you know, it's a pursuing social justice. It's important to continue that. And they've taken over academic associations, the Modern Language Association, you know, their boycott resolutions. I just saw something, I haven't read it in detail, that the leadership of the Modern Language Association has said that they're going to impose a boycott resolution, and the members can't vote on it. I mean, I'm not sure what I mean, I've gone to, you know, I've spoken out against boycotts endlessly, and it's a serious, it's a serious issue, I think. And again, I have no solutions. I mean, I'm old-fashioned, and I keep thinking, you know, just give people the real history. But people have found ways to skirt around that. I mean, you know, the slogan, from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free. So my friend Ron Hasner at Berkeley hired some survey research group to ask student protesters which river and which sea. And, you know, most people had no idea, as long as it rhymed. And that's not good for America. Forget, again, leaving aside for a second the Middle East and Israel, that's just not good for America. That's not good for the 21st century. One of my kids got involved in talking to the Philadelphia Board of Education, where they were the teachers union has been trying to introduce Palestine into the kindergarten curriculum, you know, with kafiyas and whatever. Anyway, they gave him 2 minutes to talk, and he showed me the 10th grade curriculum in the Philadelphia public school system. Now, I remember 10th grade. I mean, I loved 10th grade because it was geometry and it was world history and, English. And you barely get science and math. You get identity this and feelings that. And this is the text of the curriculum. I mean, we should be ashamed of that.
Other questions or comments? We've
Well,
come up
well,
about an hour.
I'll just say thank you, but that's sort of discouraging. But the reality, I guess.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, Donna, to sort of follow up there, it sounds like, and it's not the first time I think I or many of us have heard this, that there has been a tremendous shift in among academics from a quest for truth and accuracy to a quest for a political narrative, and that they managed to get tenure based on this, which means that higher faculty and administrators have bought into this for years also. And I think we were talking before everybody came on. I can remember protesting the Vietnam War, and I must admit, I didn't know a hell of a lot then about the situation beyond, a few points. But I think at least the points I knew had some real basis as opposed to this.
Right. Well, I can remember an anecdote that people told about Irving Howe, who is at Stanford giving a lecture when people were protesting because of something. He said, and he turned and he obviously knew Marx and very well versed, and he turned to the protester and said, "You know what you are? You're going to be a dentist when you grow up." And that was the ultimate put down. Yeah, I worry. I don't think, I think the protests have kind of captured a segment of the media that we focus on. I think the reality is a little better, when you're on campus and you're, going to class. But it's a friend of mine was asked to give a talk in 2 weeks at Columbia, and he was told they can't guarantee his safety, so he should give it by Zoom.
Well, we're having you on not as a matter of safety, but
No.
as a matter of convenience.
Oh, well,
I understand that. Yeah.
I lived in Egypt in 1973. I don't have to tell this group, what happened in 1973.
Right. All right. I don't see any other hands. But let me also, before I say anything to Donna, I want to thank Pierce, who is invisible at the moment, other than as Beth Emmett, for his technical help with not only tonight, but with getting the program publicized and out and everything else. So thank you, Pierce, and
Thank you.
and your wonderful cat that you showed me earlier. And Donna, thank you so much for sharing everything with us and for being on tonight. And thank everybody who came. We appreciate it all. And good night, everybody.
Thank you.